Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, we are revisiting a classic horror comic book from the 1970s. The very thing that Steve Donoghue hates the most. Horror comic books from the 1970s. But there is one comic book that Steve really likes that is a horror comic book from the 1970s. And that is the greatest horror comic book from the 1970s. And that is Tomb of Dracula, which we've talked about before. But Steve thought it would be a good idea to revisit Tomb of Dracula in honor and as a way of saying farewell to Horror Mayhem 2025, a great reading event dedicated to reading horror fiction here on BookTube, which is always fun and has been a lot of fun this month as well. And it's always a good time to revisit The Tomb of Dracula, a magnificent horror comic book from Marvel during the 1970s. It ran almost the whole of the 1970s. I think it ran from 1972 all the way up through 1979. It lasted 70 issues, which is a really good run for a horror comic book from Marvel. Most of Marvel's horror comic books did not last that long. The second most successful was probably Werewolf by Night. In fact, it was. Then we also had Monster of Frankenstein, which didn't last nearly that long. Ghost Rider was sort of a horror comic book and sort of a superhero comic book. And that did well. That did really well, Ghost Rider. But I don't really consider that a horror comic book in the way this one was. This was fantastic. It was written, almost the whole run was written by Marv Wolfman. He didn't write the first few issues. Every issue of the 70 issues of the regular series was drawn by Gene Colan, and he did a wonderful job. When Gene Colan heard that Marvel was going to do a Dracula comic book, he fought to get the job. He really wanted to draw Dracula, and so he drew a picture. Let me see if I could find it. I know it's in here somewhere. Here it is. He drew this original illustration of Dracula. He based the look of Dracula on the actor Jack Palance. And he turned in this picture and he got the job of drawing Dracula. And thank goodness he did, because he's a huge part of why this book was a success. This is the first Tomb of Dracula omnibus. There were 3 Tomb of Dracula omnibuses printed, but I only have the first one. It would be wonderful if they would reprint the second or third, but so far they've shown no sign that they're going to do so. They did reprint the first one a couple times. This is not how I have all of the books, though. I have all of Tomb of Dracula and these old Marvel Essential volumes, which were cheap black and white reprints. And this comic book looks wonderful in black and white. It's just fantastic. So Steve decided to revisit Tomb of Dracula, and I thought that's a good idea. We had talked about Tomb of Dracula before, but it's been a long time since I've actually read the series, so I started to read the series. And I will continue to read Tomb of Dracula, so you'll be hearing me talk about it for a while. It was really interesting because here we have a series that lasted an awful long time that is based on a villain, a straight up villain. And that is, not a unique thing in comic books. Not just Dracula, but the Joker had his own comic book series for a while. Dr. Doom had his own comic book series. But those comics, they weren't successful in the long run. There was something fascinating and interesting about Dracula, even though he was a villain. And not just a villain. I mean, this character is straight up evil. He's an evil character who does evil things and has evil schemes. And I feel part of that is that this does have in it some of the spirit of the original novel that was by written by Bram Stoker. The character in this comic book is consistent with that character, only we learn a lot more about Dracula in this series. We see an awful lot more of Dracula in the comic book series than we ever did in the novel. But this takes what we knew about Dracula in the novel and expands on that quite a bit, while remaining consistent to that character in the book. But he becomes his own thing in the comic book. The comic book was very much influenced by the Hammer horror films that came out from the 1950s and through the 1970s. Those great old Hammer horror movies, and you had that long series of Dracula movies starring Christopher Lee. There's a lot of that in here as far as the feel of the thing, and you particularly get that in the very first issue of Tomb of Dracula. It really has a Hammer horror film feel, this first story, where Frank Drake, who is a descendant of Dracula, who was also wealthy for a while but lost all his money because he's not that bright. He is a descendant of Dracula, and he inherited Dracula's castle. And as soon as his shady friend Clifton found out, he said, "Hey, you should turn the Dracula's castle into a tourist spot. You can make all your money back." So Frank Drake, Clifton, and Frank Drake's girlfriend, whose name I've already forgotten, even though I just read the comic book a couple days ago, they go to Transylvania, to Castle Dracula. And you know this is a terrible idea, but there they go. And Shady Clifton finds the tomb of Dracula, and he finds Dracula inside, just a skeleton with a stake through what used to be his heart. And foolishly, he pulls the stake out with predictable results. Dracula returns. And it's great. This first issue is actually really, really good. And the first issue was written by Jerry Conway. So the first 6 issues, they ran through different writers. The first couple issues were written by Jerry Conway. Then Archie Goodwin came in for a couple of issues. And then, of all people, Gardner Fox came in for a couple of issues. And then Marv Wolfman came on board with issue number 7. And he stuck with the book from then on. And it was just wonderful. So you had this great series of horror stories featuring Dracula and Dracula's evil schemes and terrifying plans. And Frank Drake runs into a group of vampire hunters. They seek him out because Frank Drake's girlfriend, of course, becomes a vampire, of course. And he ends up so depressed he's going to kill himself, but he's found by Rachel Van Helsing, who is a descendant of the original Van Helsing, who works for Quincy Harker, who is the son of Jonathan Harker and Mina Harker. And they are a group of vampire hunters who go after Dracula. Of course, the most famous character who came out of this series was Blade. Blade the vampire hunter makes his first appearance in Tomb of Dracula. And Tomb of Dracula was a very successful comic book in the 1970s. It wasn't quite as successful as, say, Conan, but they did the Conan thing that they did with Conan in that they gave it a companion magazine, a black and white magazine called Dracula Lives, which was really cool. It didn't last terribly long. I think it only lasted like 13 issues. So not nearly as successful as Savage Sword of Conan, which went on for years and years and years. But it was good. It was really good for the time that it existed. And like I said, I have all 70 issues as essential volumes. And in the last volume, you have a lot of those Dracula Lives stories. The stories that were originally made to be black and white, and they're really, really cool. Yeah, poor Dracula having a rough time there. And so Dracula, as great a comic book as it was, it could not outlast the 70s. So Dracula, what was that? My dog Rhonda's groaning in the background. Dracula could not exist past the 70s. So his comic book died out in 1979. But he did live on shortly after that, because there was Dracula Lives was canceled a while before, I think in 1975. But after the color comic book Dracula was canceled, there was another black and white magazine that came out, which was called Tomb of Dracula. Gene Colan came back for that, but that only lasted 6 issues. And then Dracula was gone as a character in his own book for years and years and years. Although he did show up, he showed up in the X-Men. He showed up here and there in the Marvel Universe as a villain. He showed up in other places. Eventually, he came back in this very strange miniseries called Tomb of Dracula, Day of Blood, Night of Redemption, also written by Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan with Al Williams. This has been reprinted in this Epic Collection recently. This is the Blade Epic Collection, Volume 2, which has stories from 1991 to 1993. And this Tomb of Dracula series, it came out in 1991. And so Gene Colan's artwork is quite different. This whole series is very, very strange. It's a very strange comic book. We have Frank Drake returning, and it's weird, man. It's a very weird comic book. And I read this in 1991. Of course, Blade is in it. Blade makes his return, looking very much like Gene Colan's original version of Blade. I haven't read this since it came out. I remember thinking it was very strange and kind of cool, but didn't really capture the magic of the original series for me, even though it had the original creators on it. But still, it was, it wasn't terrible. It was interesting. It was just really weird from what I remember. So I'm looking forward to reading this one again. And that was it as far as, I believe, the Tomb of Dracula itself, although Gene Colan and Marv Wolfman did return to the character of Dracula in a series called Curse of Dracula that I think was published by Dark Horse, and I remember nothing about that series. So it couldn't have been that great. But the original series was wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to reading it again. And so catch me on my weekend, or my weekly, it's weekly now, Roger, my weekly reading reports, where I will be talking about the Tomb of Dracula comics as I go through them, which should be a good time. I read the first, I think, 4 issues so far, so I haven't actually gotten to the Marv Wolfman stories again yet. And that's when, it starts getting really, really good. But even these early issues are pretty excellent, actually. Certainly the artwork is fantastic. And like I said, everything looks really, really, really good in this essential Dracula format, essential Tomb of Dracula. It's awesome. So that's all I have time for, unfortunately, because I've got to go to work. I will catch you next time, and check out Steve Donoghue's video. It should be up later on today. Bye, guys.